Thank you so much, Professor Donati. Now we open the floor for comments.
Thank you very much again for your presentation. It's always fascinating following the sophisticated articulation of your arguments. Let me start with a naive question, maybe. It's to what extent do you think that the kind of this hybridization process is different in nature, I would say, with respect to the hybridization we have seen since ever, I would say, right? Thinking of how humans have been using technology. Yeah, let's start from this, because it's of real help for me, and maybe I have a comment.
Well, thank you, Marta, for this interesting question. I think it's a very complex issues, but there are a lot of analogies, of course, with nature, what happens in nature, in physical nature, in biology, for instance. But what is different, I think, is that the hybridization in this case, in the case of the human-robot interaction, has of course, a subjective, a conscious, a reflexive dimension, which is not in physical nature. I mean, thinking about human work, of course, hybridization is a much more complex because it's a relational issue in respect to what happens in a deterministic, let's say, or quasi-deterministic field, which is, for instance, in biological nature. I think that there is a difference. There is, of course, much similar, but hybridization in the case of human activity is something which can be reversible, can be crossed, and this does not happen, I think, in nature, at least as far as I know. I don't know if it is clear, but it could be a long discourse, a long talk to differentiate natural sciences and social sciences in respect to how algorithms and artificial intelligences in general are changing our world, precisely because they are more autonomous, because they are intelligent and bright, and they can take decisions. This is a very, as you know, a very complex discourse about how conscient, how conscious and conscient is an algorithm, a robot in deciding something. I don't think that we can talk of a robot as a deciding electronic person, as someone thinks. There are people, and the Chancellor mentioned one of them, who believes that robots can be friends of human beings, who think that the algorithm, the robots, can think in the first-person perspective. This is a big issue. We can discuss about that. My criticism in respect to that perspective is that a robot could be, that it can reflect in the first-person perspective, but certainly not in the second-person perspective, which is unique of the human being. And that's why when we deal with hybridization in the human field, not in the natural field, I think things are quite different, although they have some similarities, as I told you. Okay? So.
Marcelo, and then... Okay.
I come back to my question. I understand your idea about hybridization and that could add something to the human being and to the work, to the dignity of the work, if I understand exactly. But my question is, in this world individualistic that we have, this kind of hybridization is more in the line to add something to the individual or to the society. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Paolo. Your presentation is very challenging. Now, I would like to ask you the following concerning the labor contracts, as a social relation, etc. In a very recently published book by Catherine P. Storr, she is a colleague of Jeffrey in Colombia. The title of the book, which I found it very impressive, she is professor of law, international commercial law. The title is The Code of Capital. And she says that, talking in a chapter of the book about hybridization, that there is no perspective to solve the problem in the line, in the direction that you mentioned, unless we change the fundamental structures of our market economies. Because nowadays, it is human beings that have to adapt to the machines, not vice versa. Mm-hmm. So hybridization is like dialogue. In a dialogue, A and B interact in order to form something new. Right. But in this case, hybridization will not work in the same direction, because workers have to adapt themselves in all senses to the way of reasoning, the timing, the procedure, etc. Machines will never adapt. And she says, unless we change, that is why she called it the code of capital. She says that all the laws, all the constitutions have been framed so far in order to fit the needs of capital and not of human beings. What would be your reaction?
Mm-hmm. May I? Thank you. Well, Marcelo, thank you for your question. Of course, hybridization refers much more to a societal process, a collective process, instead of an individual process. Individuals can avoid hybridization because they can subtract themselves to the process. While the societal processes, the collective processes, are very much going through the hybridization. So in that way, we can also say that, of course, we need more social solidarity in order to cope with this collective trend, collective structural conditioning of hybridization. Now, to come to Stefano's question, yes, well, I think that adaptation, as I've shown in my slides, is one of the three scenarios. Adaptation means, in fact, to go on by trial and error, in which the human being is adapting to the machine, to the robot. But there are two other scenarios going on. The unbound morphogenesis. Unbound morphogenesis means hybridization is not an adaptive system, is a chaotic system in the technical sense of the chaos theory. And the third one is the relationally steered morphogenesis. We can steer morphogenesis by thinking of hybridization precisely as a dialogue, as an interaction, as a transaction. Of course, yes, the code of capital by Pistorius, yes. I mentioned also in my paper Zubov's works on the economy of surveillance, the capitalism of control, and so on. So hybridization would be controlled by machines, by algorithms onto the human beings. Now, I think, as I've depicted in my scheme of the interaction process, I think that the human agency is still in a very important position to interact with the structural domain and the cultural domain. So the human action can change by changing the cultural domain, can also change the way in which the structural domain is configured, thought, and so on. So I think that human agency is an active part in that interaction between the human and the robot. And if we see the hybridization process in this way, there are, of course, chances, opportunities, etc., to subtract human beings from the control and the dominance of machines. So I think that hybridization is not necessarily a control by machines over people, over human beings, but could be configured differently in a very interactionist way.
Okay, thank you. We will have three more comments from Cecile, from Rocco, and from the sister.
Thank you very much. I have a double question about the notion of work dignity, and I wonder whether it will be necessary to expand this notion. You spoke of the subjective and objective dimension of work dignity, and maybe don't you think that we also have to reflect on the collective dimension of work dignity at different scales, taking into account not only the interpersonal relationship between human beings at work or human with a robot, but also the consequences, for example, of automatization on global value chains. And if we integrate in our reflection these consequences for the people, or maybe the indirect consequences on others, and also on the environment and on the evolution of climate change and all this, then even the diagnostic about the potential of artificial intelligence, much more controversial. And in a way, also, maybe it's also a question for economists and concerning and for politicians about our general perception of the fact that we know that there is a digital, the carbon footprint of the digital is also, I will speak about this tomorrow, but it's really a big question. And are we sure that that we can go on with this type of reflection on hybridization as a sustainable perspective in terms of economic models? And if we, and to put it in another way, couldn't we have a debate about high-tech versus low-tech, and under which conditions are high-tech really fostering human dignity at work? And maybe I say this because I teach in engineering schools and business schools in France, and I have many discussions with young people who graduate from these best schools and who say that they want to promote low-tech. And because their analysis consists in saying that it's not sustainable. So that's why maybe if we integrate the notion of collective responsibility at different scales, we could enrich the notion of dignity, work dignity.
Sure, okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Pierpaolo. It was great. First question, who makes the algorithms? And according to which rules are the algorithms made? Here I think we should make an important distinction between two ages in the process that you describe. There is a first stage in which men make the algorithms, and there is a second stage in which algorithms make men. I don't think we have reached that stage, although I recognize we are approaching that stage. I give you one example. Now we can produce machines that substitute the old soldiers. They can enter into the battlefield and perform all the tasks that used to be performed by soldiers. I have made a resolution in the Italian Parliament some time ago, putting the question, why don't we make a moratorium to the production of this kind of machines? And we see whether we can incorporate in the algorithm the respect of international law. For instance, as what regards women, children, old people, wounded enemies, non-belligerents, and so forth. What are the instructions that we give to these machines? Can we incorporate ethical element into the instructions that we give? The second question is, does the process you describe imply an atomization of human community? And is this atomization a precondition for the process, or a consequence of the process, or both? I explain what I mean. It seems to me that now the instructions we give to the algorithm, according to which we produce the algorithm, are instructions unilaterally oriented to the profit of the company that uses the robot or also manages the whole process. Can we imagine of, I go back to laborem exercens, can we think of a community of workers that participating in the process of production of the algorithms can force the presence in the algorithms of an element that is not just the profit model, something that is oriented not only towards Adam Smith, but Stefano would say also towards Antonio Genovesi. And who has the care for this? With other words, what is the task of politics? Now, politics can still influence the process. When we move to the second stage, a stage in which to use an expression of Sraffa, the machines produce themselves, and they can learn, and they can rewrite their original instructions, then it will be not impossible, but much more difficult. So I see here the urgence of the call to a kind of world governance that issued originally from Benedict XVI, but is repeated today with sometimes dramatic undertones by Pope Francis.
Thank you, Rocco. Professor Donati, if you agree, we can take a final comment from Sister Alford, and then we wrap up.
Yes, thank you very much. Very, very interesting paper. I'd like to just follow on a little bit, first of all, from what Professor Bottiglione was saying. You said that politics could influence this process. I would say the political process is the fundamental process going on here. It's primarily a political process. The technology is entirely taken up in the political process, which is mostly expressed through economic relations right now. But at the end of the day, as St. Thomas rightly says, it's politics which is the architectonic science, which oversees the common good. And as I say, looking at the history of the Industrial Revolution, we see that certain types of technology get developed because it's politically advantageous for certain powerful groups in society to have. I don't want to be a Marxist, but I just think we are far too timid on this. Secondly, in the 1980s, I was working directly on this. I did a PhD on the idea of human-centered technology. I had to read a lot about artificial intelligence. It was the middle of the AI winter then, so people were laughing about AI. But I have to say that, I mean, I'm not able to follow it as much as I did then. You know, it's always PhD students who are the best informed about anything that's going on. Nothing I have read changes my fundamental view about the potential of AI. I think most of the stuff that is scaring people about the future is part of this political process about getting funds, you know, the MIT type people and all that kind of thing were trying to get huge amount of funds out of the Department of Defense in the United States in the 80s, and people like Hubert Dreyfus at MIT, the philosopher who wrote the book What Computers Can't Do, and then the book What Computers Still Can't Do later on, said, yes, okay, what we're doing is improving what technology can do, but it's like climbing a tree and saying you're on the way to the moon. You know, we're so far away from anything even remotely like what they're saying we're going to get to. And at the moment, I don't see there's any possibility that we will. So I think we should be more confident about our role in this and not let these technologies cow us into not taking seriously the legal, the political, the economic side of this, which, as far as I can see, is pretty much the same as it has been up to now. And I think the historians of technology are very, very important for us on this. So I went a bit too much into that. The other thing I wanted to say was, when I was doing my thesis, everybody used Giddens, structuration. You know, you could see a lot of similarity between what Pier Paolo, Professor Donati is talking about now, and that approach. I just wonder, what is the difference between that thinking and what you're proposing here, Pier Paolo? Because that was very interesting for me to understand that. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know if I should start from the end, which is very interesting. Anyway, to reply to Cecile, I think that in my paper, what I try to do is to include the dignity of the objective world into the dignity of human work. Don't we speak about the dignity of Earth, the dignity of Amazonia, for instance, as the big forest of the world? If you take a critical realist perspective, worth is reality itself. There is an important book by Andrew Collier, a critical realist. I don't know if you know him. The title of the book is Being and Worth. Worth is simply being, is attached to being. Now, what I'm saying in other words is that perhaps our concept of work dignity is too subjective. It's too modern in the sense of subjective modernity, from Descartes up to the last century. We had also, for instance, I wrote a book on reflexivity, reflecting upon Margaret Archer's book on reflexivity. And what I've found is that still we have a very subjective, I would say subjectivist conception of dignity and reflexivity and so on. So what I'm trying to do is to look at the process of interdependence, intermingling, twining between objective and subjective dimensions of dignity and work, and the worker as well. Because otherwise we make a mistake of thinking that, for instance, also talking about Anthropocene, the environment, and so on and so forth. So we think that in the past humanity was winning upon nature. Now nature is winning upon human beings, because in reversal there is a kind of reaction. This is a dualistic way of thinking. I think that we have to think relationally. There are relations between these domains, these variables, if I am to speak in sociological terms. So dignity as well is the result of an interaction between objective and subjective factors. It's not only a subjective idea. Otherwise, how can we conceive of the dignity of the creation? The creation has its own dignity. It's not subjective. It's not an act of man, that kind of dignity, okay? So I think that in my paper I've tried to adopt a critical realist perspective and have a different idea about dignity. Now to Rocco, thank you for your very interesting questions, but again, I don't think that man makes the algorithm and the algorithm makes man. This is also a way of looking at two opposing possibilities. I think that there is an interaction simply between man and algorithms, but an interaction in which there is a possibility that the algorithm makes the algorithms. As you know, what is very challenging for the future is a future in which robots will produce more sophisticated robots without the intervention of human beings, because they can do that. They can produce more sophisticated robots, and so the issue of the ethical control of what is happening there becomes very, very important. So you are right. As far as I know, where the artificial intelligences are made and the robots are built, in Bologna they are trying to do that. They are trying to teach ethics to the robots, as you know. They structure the algorithm so that the algorithm can contain a kind of morality. Of course, again, it depends on who does that. You can teach a good ethics or a bad ethics. You could insert good or bad instructions. Certainly, a community of workers producing algorithms could be better in the sense that there is a control in a community. People are controlled by peer people. But it's not assured that a community of workers can produce a better algorithm than let's say, a small enterprise of a few people. So anyway, I think that, in fact, you are right. What we need is an ethics. What I'm saying in my paper is that it should be a relational ethics. It should not be and cannot be a one-way ethics, a way of instructing algorithms. It could and should be a relational ethics in the sense that it should be put into the dialogue, into the interactions human robots, human artificial intelligences. So to Sister Alford, well, yes, it is a political process, not in the sense of a political system. It's a political process in the sense that everything is political because it concerns the common good, the common reality in which we live. But anyway, I wouldn't be deterministic in this sense because if you accept that there is a civil society which is not political in the strict sense, the civil society is producing different algorithms, different kinds of robots and artificial intelligences, precisely because they can be produced by different people with different ideas and different scopes, different targets. Now, in respect to the structuration process theorized by Giddens, yes, there is some analogy in my paper, but I do not agree with Giddens because the structuration process in Giddens' terms is a kind of central conflation between agency and structure. And I avoid central conflation by putting a morphogenetic scheme in which the temporal phases through which agency and structure work are so different from the central conflation of Giddens. So I do not agree at all with Tony Giddens on this point, because I think that we have to distinguish the different contributions of agencies and structure and also culture, which sometimes Anthony Giddens forgets about. Okay, thank you.
Okay, we are closing this session and we will coming back at 11:15. Thank you so much.